"24 hours. That's all we got left, Carol Sue." David McCormick's weathered hands trembled as he set down the federal court summons on their kitchen table. The paper felt heavier than it should have, each word a nail in what might become Ranger's coffin. Outside, their 45-pound Bobcat sprawled across the porch swing like he owned the place, which, in David's heart, he did. 4 years of movie nights, morning coffee companionship, and gentle purrs that could calm a hurricane. Now some government pencil pusher wanted to rip their family apart. "Wildlife Enforcement Order," Carol read aloud, her voice cracking. "Immediate seizure of illegally possessed exotic animal." The phone rang, sharp and demanding. David almost didn't answer, until he heard the voice. "Mr. McCormick, this is Rebecca Walsh from Mountain View Sanctuary." Something about that voice tugged at memories buried deep. "I understand you're in trouble. Well, I'll be darned." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of the McCormick Ranch, casting long shadows across the breakfast table where David sat nursing his third cup of black coffee. His calloused fingers drummed against the ceramic mug, a nervous habit Carol had learned to recognize over 42 years of marriage. Today, it meant trouble. "You're going to wear a hole in that cup," Carol observed, setting down a plate of scrambled eggs he wouldn't touch. Her own appetite had vanished the moment that court summons arrived yesterday. 24 hours to prepare for a hearing that could destroy their family. Through the sliding glass door, they watched Ranger perform his morning patrol of the property. The Bobcat moved with the fluid grace of his wild ancestors, those distinctive ear tufts swiveling like radar dishes as he investigated every corner of his domain. To strangers, he might look dangerous, 45 pounds of muscle and instinct wrapped in spotted fur. But David saw something else entirely, a son making sure his territory was safe for his family. "He knows something's wrong," Carol whispered, watching Ranger pause by the fence line. The Bobcat's amber eyes swept the property with unusual intensity, as if sensing the invisible threat hanging over their home. David's jaw tightened. The neighbors had been complaining for months, phone calls to the county, letters to the editor about public safety concerns. Martha Henderson next door claimed Ranger made her poodle nervous. Bill Thompson worried about property values, as if love could be measured in real estate prices. The irony wasn't lost on him. These same neighbors had celebrated when Ranger helped find their missing cat last winter, following scent trails no dog could detect. They'd praised his gentle nature when he'd sat vigil beside old Mrs. Peterson's fence while she recovered from her stroke, somehow sensing her need for companionship. "Wild animals don't belong in suburban homes," the enforcement officer had declared during his inspection. Officer Jake Thompson, young enough to be David's grandson, with regulation haircut and by-the-book attitude that reminded David why he'd retired from dealing with bureaucrats. But what did paperwork know about the nights Ranger curled up beside them during thunderstorms? What did regulations understand about the way he'd learned to gentle his strength around their elderly golden retriever, Oscar? How could legal definitions capture the bond forged through 4 years of morning coffee conversations and evening movie marathons? Carol began packing Ranger's belongings into a cardboard box. His favorite rope toy, the stuffed rabbit he'd claimed as his own, the special blanket that smelled like home. Each item felt like a goodbye neither of them was ready to say. "Maybe we should have seen this coming," David muttered, watching his wife's careful preparations. "Maybe we were fooling ourselves thinking we could keep him forever." But even as the words left his mouth, David knew he'd fight this with everything he had. Some things were worth the battle. The photograph on David's desk had yellowed at the edges, but the memory remained crystal clear. 22-year-old Rebecca McCormick sat cross-legged on this very porch, her arms wrapped around a spotted bobcat that looked remarkably like Ranger. Duchess. That had been her name, the beginning of everything, and the end of so much more. "Daddy, you can't keep her," 12-year-old Rebecca had argued, her voice sharp with the righteousness only children possess. "She belongs in the wild. It's not right." David remembered how his daughter's words had stung, cutting deeper than any professional criticism. Here he was, a veterinarian who'd dedicated his life to healing animals, being lectured by his own child about what was right and wrong. But Rebecca had always been like that, fierce in her convictions, uncompromising in her beliefs about justice and fairness. Duchess had arrived at David's clinic on a rainy October evening, carried in by a park ranger who'd found her near death beside a mountain highway. Hit by a car, left hind leg shattered, internal injuries that should have killed her. The ranger had been matter-of-fact about it. "Doc, if you can't save her, we'll put her down humane. She's too far gone for wildlife rehab." But David had seen something in those amber eyes. Not just the will to live, but an intelligence that spoke to him. He'd operated through the night, Carol assisting with the same dedication she brought to every case. When Duchess finally opened her eyes 3 days later, David felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just another patient. This was family. The recovery had taken months. Duchess couldn't be released. Her injured leg left her vulnerable, unable to hunt effectively in the wild. But she adapted to life on the ranch with surprising grace, claiming the sunroom as her domain and establishing herself as the unofficial guardian of the property. She'd patrol the fence line each morning, investigate every visitor, and spend her evenings curled beside David's chair while he read veterinary journals. Rebecca had never accepted it. Even as a child, she'd possessed an unwavering moral compass that left no room for gray areas. Wild animals belonged in the wild period. The fact that Duchess couldn't survive on her own didn't matter. Keeping her was still wrong in Rebecca's eyes. "You're playing God with her life," teenage Rebecca had accused during one particularly heated argument. "Just because you can save something doesn't mean you should cage it." "She's not caged," David had replied, gesturing toward the sprawling ranch property. "She's free to roam 15 acres. She chooses to stay." "She doesn't know any better," Rebecca shot back. "You took that choice away from her when you decided her life was worth more than her freedom." The arguments had escalated over the years, becoming a wedge that slowly drove them apart. Rebecca saw her father's work with Duchess as a symbol of everything wrong with humanity's relationship to nature, the arrogance of thinking they knew what was best for wild creatures. David saw it as love, pure and simple, the love that compels you to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. Carol had tried to mediate, understanding both perspectives but torn between her husband and daughter. She'd grown to love Duchess too, marveling at the bobcat's intelligence and gentle nature with the family. But she also saw how the conflict was destroying the relationship between David and Rebecca. "She's not just angry about Duchess," Carol had told David one night after another explosive dinner argument. "She's angry because she thinks you care more about animals than people." "Than her." David had scoffed at the suggestion. Everything he did was for his family, working long hours at the clinic to provide for them, building the ranch as a legacy for Rebecca. How could she not see that? But the distance between father and daughter continued to grow. Rebecca threw herself into environmental activism at college, joining protests against zoos and exotic pet ownership. She sent home articles about captive wildlife, each one a pointed criticism of her father's choices. During her rare visits, she'd barely acknowledged Duchess, as if the bobcat was a shameful family secret. The breaking point came during Rebecca's senior year at Colorado State. She'd been accepted to graduate school for wildlife biology, planning to specialize in conservation and rehabilitation. David had been proud. Finally, something they could share. But Rebecca had other plans. "I'm moving to Oregon after graduation," she'd announced over Sunday dinner. "There's a position with a wildlife sanctuary that focuses on habitat restoration." "Oregon?" David had tried to keep the disappointment from his voice. "That's pretty far from home." "That's the point," Rebecca had replied quietly. "I need distance from all this." Her gesture encompassed the house, the ranch, and by extension Duchess sleeping peacefully in her favorite sunny spot. The final argument had been devastating. Rebecca accused her father of valuing animals over family, of choosing a bobcat over his own daughter. David, hurt and frustrated, had said things he'd regretted for 20 years, questioning Rebecca's dedication to their family, suggesting she was running away from responsibility. "Maybe I am running away," Rebecca had shouted, tears streaming down her face. "But at least I'm not pretending it's love when it's really control." She'd left the next morning, driving away in her packed Honda without saying goodbye. David had stood at the kitchen window watching until her taillights disappeared around the bend, feeling something break inside his chest that had never quite healed. The years that followed had been marked by stilted phone calls and awkward Christmas cards. Rebecca had established herself as a respected wildlife biologist, eventually founding her own sanctuary in Oregon. She'd married, divorced, built a life that deliberately excluded her childhood home. David followed her career from afar, proud but heartbroken, never quite finding the words to bridge the gap between them. Duchess had lived another 8 years, growing old gracefully on the ranch. She'd claimed David's recliner as her throne, learned to tolerate Oscar's puppyish enthusiasm, and maintained her role as the property's benevolent overseer. When cancer finally claimed her, David had held her as she passed, whispering apologies for all the choices that had cost him his daughter. They'd buried Duchess beneath the old oak tree by the stream, the same spot where she'd loved to sun herself on warm afternoons. Carol had planted wildflowers around the grave, creating a memorial garden that bloomed every spring. But the real memorial was the empty space at David's side during evening television, the silence where purrs used to rumble. "I should have handled things differently," David had told Carol on the anniversary of Duchess's death. "Maybe if I'd listened to Rebecca, really listened, things would have been different." "You can't change the past," Carol had replied, her hand finding his. "But maybe someday there'll be a chance to make things right." David had thought that chance was lost forever. 20 years of silence had a way of cementing regrets into permanent scars. But now, with Ranger facing the same fate that had once threatened Duchess, he couldn't help but wonder if history was offering him a second chance. The photograph seemed to mock him from its frame. Rebecca young and passionate, Duchess content and trusting, David caught between love and loss. If his daughter was truly calling to help save Ranger, what did that mean? Was this an opportunity for redemption, or just another chance to make the same mistakes? Outside, Ranger stretched and yawned, completely unaware of the forces gathering against him. In less than 24 hours, a judge would decide his fate. David could only hope that this time love would be enough. 18 hours until the court hearing. David had been counting down like a man watching his own execution, each tick of the kitchen clock another step closer to losing everything that mattered. He'd barely slept, spending the night in his recliner with Ranger sprawled across his lap, both of them sensing the approaching storm. The lawyer had been blunt during their morning phone call. "Mr. McCormick, I'll be honest with you. These wildlife enforcement cases rarely go in favor of private owners. The federal guidelines are pretty clear about exotic animal possession." "Ranger isn't some exotic pet," David had argued, his free hand automatically stroking the bobcat's head. "He's family. He's been with us for 4 years without a single incident." "I understand that, sir, but the law doesn't recognize emotional bonds with wildlife. We'll need character witnesses, documentation of his care, proof that he poses no public threat. Even then, the lawyer's pause spoke volumes. Carol emerged from the bedroom looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and her usually steady hands trembled as she poured coffee. "Any word from that sanctuary woman? Rebecca, what's her name?" David shook his head. The mysterious phone call from the night before had ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. Something about Rebecca Walsh's voice had stirred memories he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a half-forgotten song. Outside, the sound of gravel crunching under tires announced an unwelcome visitor. Through the window, David spotted the distinctive green and gold of a Fish and Wildlife Service vehicle pulling into their driveway. Officer Jake Thompson stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking every inch the federal bureaucrat in his pressed uniform and regulation sunglasses. "Well, I'll be damned," David muttered. "He's early." Ranger's ears perked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. The Bobcat had an uncanny ability to sense tension, and something about uniformed officials always put him on edge. David felt the muscles beneath Ranger's spotted coat tense as Thompson knocked on the front door. "Mr. McCormick, Officer Thompson, Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm here for the preliminary inspection before tomorrow's hearing." David opened the door reluctantly, keeping his body between Thompson and the interior of the house. "The hearing isn't until tomorrow morning." "This feels like harassment, officer." Thompson consulted his clipboard with bureaucratic precision. "Standard procedure, sir. I need to assess the current living conditions and document any potential safety violations." His gaze moved past David, searching for signs of the controversial Bobcat. "Ranger's not a safety violation," Carol said sharply, appearing beside her husband. "He's a member of our family." "Ma'am, with all due respect, federal law doesn't recognize family relationships with wildlife." Thompson's tone was polite but inflexible. "A 45-pound bobcat is classified as a potentially dangerous predator regardless of its behavior in captivity." The word captivity hit David like a physical blow. Ranger chose to be here, chose to curl up on their couch each evening, chose to greet them at the door when they returned from town. How could anyone call that captivity? "You want to see dangerous?" David's voice carried 4 decades of veterinary authority. "Come on in. But I'm warning you, he might purr at you. That's his most threatening behavior." Thompson followed them into the living room, his hand instinctively moving toward the radio on his belt when Ranger appeared. The Bobcat had positioned himself between the family and the stranger, not aggressively, but with unmistakable protective intent. His amber eyes tracked Thompson's every movement while his body remained relaxed, alert but not threatened. "Jesus," Thompson breathed, stopping short. "He's bigger than I expected." "And gentler than you'd believe," Carol added, settling into her chair. As if summoned, Ranger padded over and placed his head on her lap, never breaking eye contact with the officer. The message was clear. "These are my people." Thompson scribbled notes with mechanical efficiency, documenting everything from the modified pet doors to the reinforced furniture. "Mr. McCormick, I have to ask, what's your contingency plan if he becomes aggressive? Bobcats are solitary predators with documented cases of unpredictable behavior." "Unpredictable?" David laughed bitterly. "Officer, that cat has a more reliable schedule than most people I know. Every morning at 6:30 he checks the perimeter. Every evening at 7 he claims my chair for movie time. He's never once shown aggression toward a human being." "But he's still a wild animal," Thompson insisted, his pen hovering over the violation form. "His instincts could override his conditioning at any moment." As if responding to the challenge, Ranger rose from Carol's side and approached Thompson directly. The officer tensed, his hand moving again toward his radio. But instead of aggression, Ranger simply sat down 3 feet away and began grooming himself, occasionally glancing up as if to say, "See? I'm just a cat." "Remarkable," Thompson murmured, lowering his clipboard. "In 15 years of wildlife enforcement, I've never seen behavior like this. He's treating me like a guest he's evaluating." "Because that's exactly what he's doing," David explained. "Ranger understands social hierarchies, respects boundaries, responds to emotional cues. He's more socially intelligent than most dogs." Thompson spent another hour documenting Ranger's living space, the outdoor enclosure, the specialized diet, and veterinary care. Despite his professional demeanor, David noticed the officer's gradually softening expression as he observed Ranger's gentle interactions with the elderly golden retriever Oscar, who had wandered in to investigate the visitor. "I have to file a report," Thompson said finally, tucking his clipboard under his arm. "But Mr. McCormick, off the record, I've seen a lot of exotic animal seizures. Most of them, the animals are clearly stressed, poorly cared for, dangerous. This," he gestured toward Ranger, who was now sprawled on his back in a patch of sunlight, completely relaxed. "This is different." "Will you testify to that tomorrow?" Carol asked hopefully. Thompson's face closed off again, the bureaucrat replacing the man who'd just witnessed something extraordinary. "I can only report what I observe, ma'am. The judge will have to interpret that information." After Thompson left, David slumped into his chair with Ranger immediately claiming his usual position across his lap. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting the silver in David's hair and the growing shadows beneath his eyes. "What if we lose him?" Carol asked quietly, voicing the fear they'd both been avoiding. "What if tomorrow they take him away, and we never see him again?" David's hand stilled on Ranger's fur. In 4 years, he'd never allowed himself to seriously consider that possibility. Ranger had become so integral to their daily life, so essential to their happiness, that imagining existence without him felt like contemplating his own death. "Then we fight," he said finally. "We fight with everything we've got. And if that's not enough," his voice broke slightly, "if that's not enough, at least we'll know we gave him 4 years of love. 4 years of being chosen instead of abandoned." Ranger's purr rumbled through the quiet room, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their contentment. Tomorrow, that sound might be silenced forever. But tonight, for these precious remaining hours, they were still a family. The phone rang again, sharp and insistent. David almost didn't answer, until he remembered that voice from the night before, the familiarity that tugged at his heart. "Mr. McCormick, this is Rebecca Walsh again. I'm driving through the night to be there for your hearing tomorrow. There are some things you need to know about Ranger, things that might change everything." David's grip tightened on the phone. 18 hours until Judgment Day, and suddenly the past was calling to offer salvation. 12 hours until the hearing. The Oregon license plate on the dusty pickup truck told David everything he needed to know, but his heart wasn't ready for the truth. He stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug forgotten in his trembling hands, watching a woman climb out of the driver's seat with movements that echoed through 20 years of memory. Rebecca. She'd grown older, of course, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, lines around her eyes that spoke of decades in the mountain sun. But the way she paused at the gate, gathering herself before approaching the house, that was pure Rebecca McCormick, always thinking, always preparing for battle. "Carol," David called, his voice barely above a whisper. "You better come see this." Carol appeared at his shoulder, took one look through the window, and sank into the nearest chair. "Sweet Lord in heaven, that's your Rebecca, isn't it?" David couldn't speak, couldn't move. 20 years of silence, 20 years of wondering if his daughter would ever forgive him. And here she stood at his gate like an answer to prayers he'd been too proud to voice. Ranger sensed the electric tension filling the room. The bobcat padded over to David, rubbing against his legs with unusual insistence. Animals always knew when their humans needed comfort. The knock came soft but firm. David's legs felt like lead as he crossed to the door, each step carrying the weight of 2 decades worth of regret and hope. "Hello, Daddy?" The years collapsed between them. Rebecca stood on his porch looking like a ghost of Christmas past, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt that made her look like the little girl who used to help him with evening chores. But her eyes, those were older, wiser, carrying pain he'd helped put there. "Becca," the name came out cracked, broken. "What are you... how did you..." "You're in trouble," she said simply. "Family helps family. Even when family's been too stubborn to talk for 20 years. Behind him, Carol made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "Rebecca, honey, come in. Please come in." But Rebecca's attention had already shifted to something else. Ranger had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. For a moment, stepfather and daughter locked eyes, the past and present colliding in a single, loaded glance. Then something extraordinary happened. Ranger, who was usually cautious around strangers, approached Rebecca directly. He sniffed her outstretched hand, then did something that made David's breath catch. He rubbed against her legs with the same affection he showed family. "He knows," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Somehow, he knows." "Knows what?" David managed. Rebecca looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, I've been following Ranger's story for 4 years. Ever since he showed up at Redwood Wildlife Center. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment to come home." The world tilted on its axis. You've been watching?" "Dr. Sarah Chen calls me every few months with updates. She was my professor at Colorado State before she took the position at Redwood." Rebecca's words tumbled out in a rush, 20 years of held secrets finally breaking free. When Ranger arrived, she recognized something familiar about him. She asked me to look at photos, and I knew immediately. "Knew what?" Carol asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. Rebecca knelt beside Ranger, her hands gentle as she examined his face, his markings, the distinctive pattern of spots along his flanks. "Daddy, look at him. Really look. Remember Duchess?" David felt the blood drain from his face. The resemblance had always been there. He told himself it was just his imagination, wishful thinking from an old man who missed his first Bobcat family member. But seeing Rebecca beside Ranger, the truth became undeniable. "That's impossible," he breathed. "Duchess died 8 years ago. She was already elderly, past breeding age." "No, Daddy, she wasn't." Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. "I had her age wrong when I was young. Dr. Chen ran the genetic markers when Ranger arrived at the center. There's no doubt, he's Duchess's son." The silence that followed was deafening. David sank into his chair, Ranger immediately jumping onto his lap as if sensing his human's emotional earthquake. The bobcat's purr rumbled against David's chest, the same sound that had comforted him during those lonely years after Rebecca left. "You knew," David said finally. "All this time, you knew he was family, and you let me think." "I let you choose," Rebecca corrected. "I wanted to see if you'd learned anything from our fight about Duchess, if you'd keep him out of love or guilt." The accusation stung because it carried truth. David remembered his early doubts about keeping Ranger, the voices in his head that sounded suspiciously like his daughter's 20-year-old arguments about captivity and control. "And what's your verdict?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rebecca watched Ranger stretch across David's lap, completely relaxed and trusting. She saw the way the bobcat's presence calmed her father's obvious anxiety. the way both man and animal had found peace in each other's company. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes love looks different than we expect. Sometimes the right thing isn't what the textbooks say. It's what the heart knows." Carol spoke up from her corner, her voice tight with emotion. "Rebecca, honey, why didn't you call? All these years we thought you hated us, thought you blamed your father for choosing animals over family." "I did blame him," Rebecca admitted. "For a long time, I thought Daddy cared more about his wounded strays than his own daughter. It took me years to understand that healing broken things was how he showed love, how he tried to heal the broken things in himself." David's throat closed up. In 42 years of marriage, he'd never been able to explain to Carol why he couldn't turn away from suffering animals, how each rescue felt like a chance to save something in himself that had been damaged long before Rebecca was born. "The fight we had about Duchess," Rebecca continued, "I was really fighting about feeling abandoned. Mom had just died. You were working 18-hour days at the clinic, and then this Bobcat showed up and suddenly got all your attention." "Your mother?" David looked confused. "Rebecca, your mother's sitting right there." Rebecca smiled through her tears. "Carol's my stepmother, Daddy. The best stepmother a girl could ask for. But she's not the woman who gave birth to me. Don't you remember? My biological mother died when I was 11. Car accident on her way to pick me up from school." The memory hit David like a physical blow. Sarah, his first wife, Rebecca's mother, the grief had been so overwhelming that he'd buried it deep, thrown himself into work to avoid confronting the loss. By the time he'd met Carol 3 years later, he'd trained himself not to think about Sarah, not to talk about the woman whose death had nearly destroyed him. "I was so angry after Mom died," Rebecca continued. "Angry at the drunk driver, angry at God, angry at you for not being able to save her like you saved all those animals. When Duchess showed up, it felt like you were replacing Mom with another female you could rescue." "Rebecca," David started, but she held up her hand. "I know now that wasn't true. I know you loved Mom, and I know you love me. It just took me 20 years and one very special Bobcat to understand that your way of loving is to never give up on anyone, human or animal." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Ranger's eyes. 12 hours until the hearing that would determine whether this family, this improbable, miraculous family, would be allowed to stay together. "So you came back to help us fight?" Carol asked. Rebecca nodded. "I came back to testify that some bonds transcend species, that some rescues rescue the rescuer just as much as the rescued." She looked directly at her father. "And I came back to tell you I'm sorry. Sorry it took me so long to come home." David reached out with his free hand, the one not currently occupied by a purring bobcat, and touched his daughter's face for the first time in 20 years. "Welcome home, baby girl. Welcome home." 6 hours until the hearing. The McCormick kitchen had become a war room, papers scattered across every surface while 3 generations worked to build their defense. Rebecca sat at the table with her laptop open, typing furiously while David and Carol gathered documentation from 4 years of Ranger's life with them. "Veterinary records," Carol announced, adding another folder to the growing pile. "Every checkup, every vaccination, dietary modifications for his arthritis." She paused, her voice catching. "The emergency surgery when he ate that tennis ball 2 years ago." David smiled despite the circumstances, remembering how Ranger had looked so guilty in his cone of shame, how the whole family had taken shifts sleeping beside his recovery crate. "He learned his lesson about tennis balls, didn't he?" "The hard way," Rebecca chuckled, looking up from her screen. "Dr. Chen mentioned that in one of her emails. Said she'd never seen a bobcat show such clear understanding of cause and effect. But even as they worked, memories kept intruding. David found himself drifting between present crisis and past recollections, the weight of 20 years pressing against his chest like a stone. He remembered the day they'd first brought Ranger home from the sanctuary. The Bobcat had been so thin, so broken, carrying wounds that went deeper than physical trauma. Carol had set up a recovery space in their sunroom, complete with heated blankets and soft music playing constantly. "He won't even look at us," Carol had worried during those first weeks. Ranger had pressed himself into the far corner, accepting food only when they left the room entirely. His amber eyes held a wariness that spoke of betrayal, of trust shattered by human hands, but David had recognized that look. He'd seen it in Duchess all those years ago, that careful distance between hope and despair. "He's been hurt before," David had told his wife. "Probably kept as a pet by someone who didn't understand what they were taking on. When he got too big, too wild, they threw him away." The breakthrough had come slowly, measured in inches rather than miles. First, Ranger began eating while they remained in the room. Then he started watching them with curiosity instead of fear. David had started reading aloud during his evening visits, veterinary journals at first, then switching to novels when he noticed how Ranger's ears perked up at different vocal tones. "You like stories, don't you, boy?" David had murmured one evening, noting how the Bobcat crept closer when he read passages with emotional dialogue. "Well, I've got plenty of those." The first time Ranger had voluntarily approached them had been during a thunderstorm. Lightning split the sky while thunder shook the windows, and suddenly the traumatized Bobcat was pressing against David's legs, seeking comfort from the humans he'd learned to trust. That night, Ranger had slept curled beside their bed, and by morning, the last walls between them had crumbled. "I still have the video from his first Christmas with us," Carol said now, pulling David back to the present. She scrolled through her phone, finding the clip that never failed to make them smile. "Look at this." On the small screen, a healthier Ranger investigated the wrapped presents under their tree with the careful precision of a bomb disposal expert. He'd sniffed each package methodically before gently batting at the ribbons, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial caution about the strange new additions to his territory. "He opened his own presents," Rebecca laughed, watching her father's face soften as he relived the memory. Like he understood it was a celebration. "He did understand," David insisted. "That cat has always been smarter than we gave him credit for. Watch this part." In the video, Ranger had carefully unwrapped a catnip-filled toy, using his teeth to remove the paper without shredding it. Then he'd carried his gift directly to David and Carol, dropping it at their feet before settling down to play, a clear gesture of gratitude and inclusion. But the past wasn't all warmth and Christmas mornings. David's memory drifted to darker times, particularly the day they'd almost lost Ranger to his own trauma. It had been 6 months after his arrival, during what should have been a routine visit from Dr. Chen for his annual checkup. The moment Ranger saw the medical equipment, something in him snapped. The calm, gentle creature they'd grown to love vanished, replaced by a terrified wild animal who saw only threat and confinement. He destroyed half the sunroom, David remembered aloud. Knocked over furniture, tore through the screen door, hid under the porch for 3 days. "What brought him back?" Rebecca asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. "Oscar," Carol answered, smiling at the memory of their elderly golden retriever. "That old dog just sat by the porch for 3 days straight, waiting. Wouldn't come in for meals, wouldn't leave his post. On the 3rd day, Ranger finally came out, and Oscar just accepted him. No drama, no fear, just, 'Oh, there you are. I was worried.'" The friendship between Ranger and Oscar had become legendary among their veterinary colleagues. Despite the obvious predator-prey relationship their species should have maintained, The two animals had developed a bond that transcended biology. Oscar, in his golden retriever wisdom, seemed to understand that Ranger needed stability, consistency, acceptance without judgment. Oscar's slowing down now, David admitted quietly. Cancer. The vet says maybe 6 months if we're lucky. Rebecca's face crumpled. Oh, Daddy, I didn't know. I should have been here. You're here now, Carol said firmly. And Oscar's comfortable. Ranger seems to know something's wrong. He's been extra gentle with him lately, staying close when Oscar has bad days. As if summoned by their conversation, both animals appeared in the kitchen doorway. Oscar moved slowly, his golden coat now more gray than gold, while Ranger shadowed his every step with protective vigilance. The Bobcat had positioned himself as Oscar's unofficial caregiver, sleeping beside the older dog's bed and alerting the humans whenever Oscar seemed distressed. Look at them, Rebecca whispered, tears threatening again. Look how Ranger takes care of him. It was true. Over the past months, as Oscar's condition deteriorated, Ranger had assumed the role of gentle guardian. He'd learned to moderate his playfulness around the aging dog, offering comfort through presence rather than energy. During Oscar's chemotherapy treatments, Ranger would curl up beside him, that deep purr providing a soothing soundtrack to recovery. The judge needs to see this, Rebecca said decisively. This isn't just about keeping an exotic pet. This is about family bonds that go beyond species. But even as they documented these beautiful moments, the shadow of tomorrow's hearing loomed large. David found himself studying Ranger with new intensity, memorizing details in case this was their last night together. The way the Bobcat's ear tufts twitched when he was concentrating, how his amber eyes reflected the kitchen lights like small suns, the particular rumble of his purr when he was completely content. What if we lose? David voiced the fear they'd all been avoiding. What happens to him then? Rebecca's expression grew fierce, reminding David powerfully of the determined little girl who'd once argued so passionately for what she believed was right. Then we appeal. We fight every day until we win, or until there's no fight left to fight. And if the appeals fail, then at least we'll know we gave him a family who loved him unconditionally, Carol said, echoing David's earlier words. Some animals live their whole lives without ever knowing that kind of love. Through the kitchen window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the horizon. 6 hours had somehow become 3, time moving with the relentless pace of an approaching storm. Soon they would load into the car and drive to a courthouse where strangers would decide Ranger's fate based on laws and regulations that had never contemplated the possibility of love transcending species boundaries. But for now, in this moment, they were still a family. David reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ears, feeling the familiar vibration of contentment rumble through the Bobcat's chest. Whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it together. The phone rang one more time, piercing the pre-dawn quiet. David almost ignored it until he saw Dr. Chen's name on the caller ID. David, I'm sorry to call so early, but I have news about Ranger. Something that changes everything. 2 hours until the hearing. The Klamath County Courthouse stood like a fortress of bureaucracy against the morning sky, its concrete facade offering no comfort to the families whose lives would be decided within its walls. David sat in the passenger seat of Rebecca's pickup truck, his weathered hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. You ready for this, Daddy? Rebecca asked, though her own voice betrayed the nervousness she was trying to hide. David looked back at the specialized transport crate in the truck bed, where Ranger waited with surprising calm. The Bobcat had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense his family's emotions, and this morning he seemed to understand that something momentous was happening. Ready as I'll ever be, David replied, though the words felt hollow. 24 hours ago, he'd been a retired veterinarian enjoying his morning coffee with his unusual but beloved pet. Now he was about to defend his family's right to exist in front of a federal judge who probably saw him as just another exotic animal hoarder. The courthouse parking lot was already buzzing with activity despite the early hour. News vans from 3 different stations had set up along the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Protesters had gathered on both sides of the entrance. One group holding signs reading, "Wild animals belong in the wild," and "Stop exotic pet abuse," while a smaller but equally passionate group countered with, "Families come in all forms," and "Love knows no species." Good Lord, Carol breathed, staring at the circus they'd have to navigate. How did this become such a big deal? Rebecca grimaced. Social media. The story went viral yesterday after someone leaked details about the hearing. Save Ranger is trending nationwide. David felt a chill run down his spine. He'd never wanted this kind of attention, never imagined that their quiet family life would become a public spectacle. But there was no backing down now. Too much was at stake. Officer Thompson appeared at their truck window, his expression unreadable behind regulation sunglasses. "Mr. McCormick, we need to transport the animal through the service entrance to avoid the crowd." "His name is Ranger," David said firmly. "And he's not the animal. He's family." Something flickered across Thompson's face, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect. "Yes, sir. Ranger. If you'll follow me, we can get him inside safely." The service entrance led through a maze of corridors that smelled of disinfectant and old documents. Courthouse employees peered out of doorways as they passed, drawn by curiosity about the Bobcat who'd sparked a national debate. Ranger remained calm in his crate, occasionally chirping in response to voices, his amber eyes alert but unafraid. Judge William Patterson's courtroom was packed beyond capacity. David recognized faces from town, neighbors who'd complained about Ranger, but also Mrs. Peterson from down the road, who credit Ranger with keeping her company during her stroke recovery. Bill Thompson sat in the front row, his expression conflicted. Martha Henderson glared from across the aisle, her poodle-owning righteousness radiating disapproval. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patterson," the bailiff announced. Judge Patterson was younger than David had expected, maybe 55, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of outdoor hobbies and practical experience. His gray eyes swept the packed courtroom with obvious displeasure. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a legal hearing, not a circus. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed immediately." His gaze lingered on the news cameras positioned at the back of the room. "This court will determine whether Mr. David McCormick is in violation of federal wildlife protection statutes by maintaining possession of a North American bobcat without proper permits." The prosecution went first, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Morrison, a sharp-faced woman who approached the podium with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case like this. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Federal law prohibits private ownership of native wildlife species without explicit permits, which Mr. McCormick does not possess. The defendant has maintained illegal possession of a bobcat for 4 years in direct violation of the Lacey Act and multiple Fish and Wildlife Service regulations." Morrison's presentation was clinical, methodical, and devastating. She cited case law, federal precedents, and expert testimony about the dangers of keeping wild predators in residential settings. Her arguments painted David as a well-meaning but misguided man whose emotional attachment was blinding him to public safety concerns. "The state of Oregon maintains excellent wildlife rehabilitation facilities," Morrison continued. "Facilities specifically designed to house animals like this bobcat safely, where he can live out his natural lifespan without posing risks to the community." David's lawyer, Marcus Webb, countered with equal precision but less coldness. A man in his 60s with the kind of rumpled appearance that spoke of long nights and passionate commitment to his clients, Webb had handled dozens of exotic animal cases over his career. Your Honor, this case isn't about technicalities, it's about family. For 4 years, Ranger has lived peacefully with the McCormick family, posing no threat to anyone. He's received exceptional veterinary care, lives on 15 acres of rural property, and has formed bonds with his human and animal companions that transcend typical pet relationships. Webb called his first witness, Dr. Patricia Hayes, the exotic animal specialist who'd been monitoring Ranger's health. Her testimony painted a picture of an animal so well adjusted to domestic life that forcing him into institutional care would constitute cruelty. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hayes stated, removing Ranger from his current environment would cause severe psychological trauma. He's bonded to this family in ways that are extraordinary for his species. Bobcats are typically solitary, yet Ranger has developed complex social relationships that demonstrate remarkable adaptability. But it was Carol's testimony that brought tears to eyes throughout the courtroom. She spoke about Ranger's gentle nature, his intelligence, his role as Oscar's caregiver during the old dog's cancer treatment. "He's not a wild animal anymore," Carol said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "He's our son. He chooses to be with us every single day. When the doors open, he doesn't run toward the woods. He runs toward us." The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Morrison hammered away at the illegality of their situation, the precedent that allowing private ownership would set, the impossibility of truly domesticating a wild predator. "Mrs. McCormick, you say this animal is like a son to you. But would you allow a human child to remain with adoptive parents who had kidnapped him simply because he'd grown attached to his captors?" The analogy hit like a physical blow, and David watched Carol struggle to maintain her composure. "How do you argue against a comparison that reduces your most profound relationship to a crime?" Then Rebecca took the stand. David had expected his daughter to testify about Ranger's rehabilitation, perhaps mention the genetic connection to Duchess. Instead, she did something that caught everyone, including David, completely off guard. "Your Honor, I need to confess something. I orchestrated this entire situation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Judge Patterson's gavel cracked like thunder, restoring order to the chaos Rebecca's words had unleashed. "What do you mean, Ms. Walsh?" the judge asked carefully. Rebecca took a deep breath, her eyes finding David's across the courtroom. 4 years ago, when Ranger arrived at Redwood Wildlife Center, Dr. Chen contacted me because she suspected a genetic connection to my father's former Bobcat, Duchess. I confirmed that suspicion through DNA testing. Ranger is Duchess's son. Morrison was on her feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness hasn't been qualified as a genetic expert, and no such DNA evidence has been presented to this court." "I have the results right here," Rebecca said calmly, producing a manila envelope. Dr. Chen conducted the testing through her university laboratory. But more importantly, I want this court to understand that Ranger didn't end up with my father by accident. I deliberately arranged for him to be placed there. The judge leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Continue, Miss Walsh." 20 years ago, I left home because I disagreed with my father's decision to keep Duchess. I believed wild animals belonged in the wild period. I spent 2 decades building a career in wildlife conservation, convinced I was right and he was wrong. Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she continued. But when Ranger appeared, traumatized and unable to survive in the wild, I saw an opportunity to test my own beliefs. If my father truly loved animals for their own sake, he would choose Ranger's well-being over his own desires. If keeping him was really about control or ego, that would become apparent over time. David felt as if the world had tilted off its axis. Rebecca had been watching, judging, testing him for 4 years without his knowledge. "And what conclusion did you reach?" Judge Patterson asked. Rebecca smiled through her tears. "That love transcends species, Your Honor. That sometimes the most natural thing is the most unnatural arrangement. My father didn't keep Ranger because he wanted to own a wild animal. He kept him because Ranger needed to be kept. And Ranger didn't stay because he was caged. He stayed because he was loved." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Patterson absorbed this revelation. Outside, protesters continued their chanting, but inside, something had shifted. The cold legal proceedings had become a story about family, forgiveness, and the complex negotiations between love and law. "This court will recess for 1 hour while I consider all testimony," Patterson announced. "When we reconvene, I'll render my decision." As the gavel fell, David realized that whatever happened next, Rebecca had already given him something more valuable than victory. She'd given him understanding. After 20 years, his daughter finally saw that his love for broken things wasn't a flaw. It was a gift. 1 hour, 60 minutes to decide whether the family David had built over 4 years would be torn apart by a federal judge's gavel. The courthouse corridor buzzed with tension as supporters and opponents of the McCormick family clustered in opposing camps, their whispered conversations creating a low hum of anxiety that matched David's racing heartbeat. Rebecca sat beside him on the hard wooden bench, her hand finding his for the first time since she was 12 years old. The simple gesture carried 20 years of unspoken apologies and forgiveness. But David couldn't fully appreciate the moment, not with Ranger's fate hanging in the balance. "I should have told you sooner," Rebecca said quietly. "About the DNA testing, about watching from afar. I was trying to protect myself from being wrong again." "Wrong about what?" David asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Wrong about you?" "Wrong about what love looks like." Rebecca's voice carried the weight of decades-old guilt. "When I was 12 and angry about Mom's death, I convinced myself that you loved animals more than people. It was easier than accepting that some kinds of love can't prevent loss." Carol approached from the water fountain, her own face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She'd spent the recess on the phone with Dr. Hayes, gathering additional documentation that might sway the judge's decision. "Any word from in there?" she asked, nodding toward the closed courtroom doors. David shook his head. Through the small windows he could see Judge Patterson hunched over his desk, surrounded by law books and case files. The man's expression was unreadable, his pen moving occasionally across legal pads as he weighed precedent against compassion. "Mr. McCormick?" A young woman with a press badge approached, hesitantly. "I'm Sarah Martinez from Channel 7 News. Could I ask you a few questions about your relationship with Ranger?" "Not now," Rebecca said firmly, stepping between the reporter and her father. "This is a family matter." But David placed a gentle hand on his daughter's arm. "It's okay." He looked at the reporter with tired eyes. "What do you want to know?" "Sir, critics say you're anthropomorphizing a wild animal, projecting human emotions onto a creature that's incapable of genuine affection. How would you respond to that?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that went to the heart of everything he believed about the bonds between species. "Miss, I've been a veterinarian for 40 years. I've seen thousands of animals, worked with everything from hamsters to horses. I know the difference between projection and genuine connection." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Ranger chooses to be with us every single day. When he's outside and the gates open, he doesn't run toward the woods. He runs toward the house. When I'm sick, he stays beside my bed. When Oscar was going through chemotherapy, Ranger appointed himself as nurse and comfort companion, That's not projection. That's love, pure and simple. But he's still a wild animal, the reporter pressed. Doesn't keeping him violate his essential nature? His essential nature was violated the day someone took him from his mother as a kitten, declawed him, filed his teeth, and kept him in a cage until he was too big to handle, David replied, his voice growing stronger. We didn't make him dependent on humans. We just gave him a family that wouldn't abandon him when he needed us most. The reporter scribbled notes, clearly moved by David's passionate defense. What happens if the judge rules against you today? David's throat tightened. Then we say goodbye to our son and hope that wherever they take him, someone will love him half as much as we do. Before the reporter could ask another question, the bailiff emerged from the courtroom. The judge is ready to reconvene. The walk back into the courtroom felt like a death march. David's legs seemed barely capable of carrying him, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Ranger's transport crate had been positioned near the defense table, and through the mesh, David could see those amber eyes watching him with complete trust. "How can you look at me like that?" David whispered to the Bobcat. "How can you still trust me when I might not be able to protect you?" Ranger's response was a soft chirp, the same sound he made every morning when greeting his family. It was a sound of contentment, of belonging, of absolute faith in the humans who'd chosen to love him. Judge Patterson entered the courtroom with the measured pace of a man carrying the weight of Solomon's judgment. The packed gallery fell silent as he took his seat, the only sound the rustle of papers and the distant chanting of protesters outside. "I have spent the past hour reviewing federal statutes, precedent cases, and the testimony presented today," Patterson began, his voice carefully neutral. "This case presents a conflict between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice that is both legally complex and emotionally compelling." David's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. Beside him, Rebecca held her breath while Carol closed her eyes in silent prayer. The prosecution has correctly identified multiple violations of federal wildlife protection statutes. Mr. McCormick has maintained possession of a native bobcat without proper permits for 4 years. Under a strict interpretation of the law, the state's case is clear-cut. Morrison nodded with satisfied confidence, already mentally preparing her victory statement for the press. "However," Patterson continued, and the single word shifted the entire atmosphere of the room, "the law must be applied with wisdom, not merely precision. The evidence presented today reveals circumstances that transcend typical exotic animal violations." The judge paused, his gaze moving from David to Ranger's crate, then to the packed gallery of supporters and opponents. "Ms. Walsh's testimony has introduced elements that fundamentally alter my understanding of this case. The revelation that she orchestrated Ranger's placement with the McCormick family, combined with the genetic evidence connecting him to their previously owned bobcat, suggests a level of deliberate care and consideration rarely seen in exotic animal cases." David's heart began to flutter with something that might have been hope. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "Dr. Hayes's expert testimony convincingly demonstrates that removing Ranger from his current environment would cause significant psychological trauma. The bond he has formed with the McCormick family and their other animals represents a unique accommodation between wild nature and domestic life." Morrison was leaning forward now, her confident expression beginning to crack around the edges. "But I cannot ignore the broader implications of my decision. If I allow the McCormick family to retain custody of Ranger, I risk setting a precedent that could be used to justify other illegal wildlife possession. The law exists to protect wild animals from exploitation and inappropriate captivity." The courtroom held its collective breath as Patterson wrestled with the impossible balance between compassion and consequence. However, after careful consideration, I find that the unique circumstances of this case, the animal's traumatic history, his inability to survive in the wild, the exceptional level of care he has received, and the extraordinary bond he has formed with his current family, justify an exception to standard enforcement. A gasp ran through the gallery, hope and disbelief warring in the faces of Rangers' supporters. Therefore, I am ordering that Mr. McCormick be granted emergency custodial status for Ranger pending the completion of proper federal permits within 90 days. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will work with the family to ensure all legal requirements are met, including regular inspections and continued veterinary monitoring. The courtroom erupted. Supporters cheered while opponents shouted their disapproval. Morrison threw her papers down in disgust, already calculating her appeal strategy. But David heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the transport crate where Ranger waited, still trusting, still patient, still theirs. "Furthermore," Patterson said, raising his voice over the commotion, "I am recommending that this case be used as a template for developing more nuanced federal guidelines regarding human-wildlife bonds in exceptional circumstances." As the gavel fell, officially ending the hearing, David felt Rebecca's arms around him, felt Carol's tears on his shoulder, felt the weight of 4 years of love and worry finally lifting from his chest. They had won, not just the legal battle, but something more fundamental. They had won the right to be a family. But even in victory, David knew the real test lay ahead. 90 days to prove they deserved the miracle they'd been granted. 90 days to show the world that love really could transcend the boundaries that laws and biology tried to enforce. Through it all, Ranger watched from his crate with those wise amber eyes, as if he'd known all along that families like theirs were worth fighting for. 3 months later, the McCormick Ranch glowed golden in the evening light of an Indian summer sunset. David sat in his favorite recliner, the leather worn smooth by decades of use, while Ranger sprawled across his lap with the contented weight of absolute belonging. The bobcat's purr rumbled like distant thunder, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their healing. The federal permits had arrived 2 weeks ahead of schedule, official documents that transformed Ranger from a legal liability into a legitimately recognized member of an alternative family structure. Dr. Hayes had been instrumental in the process, her monthly reports documenting not just Ranger's physical health, but his remarkable emotional intelligence and social adaptation. "Still can't believe we pulled it off," David murmured, his weathered fingers tracing the distinctive pattern of spots along Ranger's flank. The bobcat opened one amber eye in acknowledgement before settling back into his evening meditation. From the kitchen came the sound of Rebecca and Carol preparing dinner together, their laughter mixing with the clink of plates and silverware. The daughter, who'd been absent for 20 years, had extended her stay indefinitely, officially transferring her sanctuary operations to Oregon to be closer to family. The healing between father and daughter had been gradual but profound, built on shared work and rediscovered understanding. "Daddy, come see this," Rebecca called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the same excitement it had held when she was 12. The evening news is running a follow-up story. On the small television screen, Channel 7's Sarah Martinez stood outside the courthouse where their battle had been won. Behind her, a graphic displayed the hashtag #RangerLaw, which had become shorthand for the new federal guidelines their case had inspired. 3 months after a federal judge ruled that love knows no species boundaries, Martinez reported, the McCormick family ruling has led to 17 similar cases nationwide where human-wildlife bonds are being evaluated under new compassionate use criteria. David shook his head in wonder. They'd never intended to start a movement, never imagined their quiet family drama would inspire legislative change. But apparently, their story had touched something deep in the American psyche, the belief that families come in all forms, that love transcends arbitrary boundaries. The camera cut to an interview with Judge Patterson, who looked remarkably relaxed for a federal official who'd essentially rewritten wildlife law from the bench. The McCormick case forced us to confront the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice, he explained. Sometimes precedent must bend to accommodate the reality of genuine interspecies bonds. But the most moving segment featured families from across the country who'd been reunited with their own rescued animals, a Florida couple with a one-winged hawk, a Montana rancher with an orphaned bear cub, a California family with a blind coyote. Each story echoed their own. Animals too damaged for traditional wildlife rehabilitation finding healing through unconventional love. We're not advocating for people to capture wild animals as pets, one wildlife biologist explained in the segment. But we're recognizing that sometimes the most humane solution isn't the most textbook solution. The news segment concluded with footage that David recognized from their own security camera. Ranger and Oscar playing gentle games in the backyard, the massive Bobcat moderating his strength to accommodate the elderly golden retriever's limited mobility. The image of predator and prey choosing friendship over biology had become an internet sensation, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. "That video's going to outlive all of us," Carol laughed, settling into her spot on the couch where Luna immediately claimed her lap. The border collie had become Ranger's shadow, following him on his morning patrols and curling up beside him during afternoon naps. Watching Luna overcome her fear of predators had been almost as remarkable as watching Ranger learn to trust humans again. The phone rang and Rebecca answered with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been fielding media calls for months. "McCormick residence?" "Yes, this is Rebecca. From Japan?" "Really?" She covered the phone's mouthpiece, her eyes wide with amazement. "It's a documentary crew from Tokyo. They want to do a feature story about alternative family structures." David waved dismissively. "Tell them we're not running a zoo here. We're just a family trying to live in peace." But even as he spoke, David understood that their story had grown beyond their control. The viral video of Ranger's evening ritual, the nightly movie session where a wild predator chose domesticity over freedom, had become a symbol of hope for anyone who'd ever felt like they didn't fit traditional molds. The documentary crew could wait. Tonight was about family time, about the quiet miracle of their daily routine. As darkness settled over the Oregon countryside, the McCormick household performed its evening ballet with practiced precision. Carol prepared Ranger's specialized dinner, while Rebecca updated his health log for Dr. Hayes. David conducted the nightly check of the property's security systems, motion sensors and cameras installed not to keep Ranger in, but to keep potential threats out. The Bobcat had attracted unwanted attention from exotic animal dealers and misguided activists who still believed he belonged in a cage. "Ready for movie night, big guy?" David asked as Ranger finished his dinner. The Bobcat's response was immediate and enthusiastic, a chirping sound that had become his way of saying yes to family activities. The living room settled into its familiar configuration. David in his recliner with Ranger draped across his lap, Carol on the couch with Luna, Rebecca in the antique rocker that had belonged to David's grandmother. Oscar had passed peacefully in his sleep 6 weeks after the court victory, but his memory lingered in the way Ranger still checked the elderly dog's favorite sleeping spot each morning. Tonight's entertainment was a nature documentary about North American wildlife, a choice that always fascinated David because of Ranger's reaction to seeing his wild cousins on screen. The Bobcat would watch intently as his species stalked through pristine forests, his ears swiveling with each sound of birds or rustling leaves. "Do you miss it?" David asked quietly. studying Ranger's profile as wild bobcats padded across the television screen. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like out there?" Ranger's response was to shift position slightly, one large paw reaching up to pat David's cheek with the gentleness that had convinced a federal judge that some bonds transcend biology. The gesture was deliberate, communicative, Ranger's way of saying, "This is where I belong." The documentary narrator spoke about the solitary nature of bobcats, their territorial instincts and preference for isolation. David smiled, watching his thoroughly social bobcat purr contentedly while surrounded by his chosen family. Science could explain behavior patterns and evolutionary adaptations, but it couldn't account for the miraculous exceptions that proved every rule had room for love. "You know what I realized today?" Rebecca said during a commercial break, her voice thoughtful. "All those years I spent arguing about what was natural versus unnatural, I was missing the point. The most natural thing in the world is caring for those who need care, regardless of species." "Some blessings come disguised as troubles," Carol added, quoting her grandmother's favorite saying. "When Ranger first showed up so broken and traumatized, I thought we were taking on an impossible burden. Instead, he brought our family back together." David nodded, remembering his own journey from the grief-stricken widower who'd poured his heart into healing wounded animals to the grandfather figure who'd learned that healing worked both ways. Every animal he'd rescued had taught him something about resilience, about the capacity for trust to bloom again after betrayal. "The reporter asked me yesterday if I had any regrets," David said, his voice growing contemplative. "About the legal battle, the publicity, the way our private life became a public cause." "And what did you tell her?" Rebecca asked. "I told her that the only thing I regret is how long it took us to understand that family isn't about blood or species. It's about choosing to show up for each other every single day." Outside, the Oregon night settled over their property with the peaceful sounds of crickets and distant owls. Inside, the McCormick family continued their evening ritual, 3 humans and 1 remarkable bobcat proving that love really could rewrite the rules. As the documentary concluded and David reached for the remote to start their traditional second feature, a classic western that Ranger seemed to enjoy for its wide-open landscapes, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Chen at the Wildlife Center. "Thought you'd like to know. We just received a traumatized lynx who can't be released. The new federal guidelines mean we can look for a special placement. Any chance you know someone who might be interested in expanding their family?" David showed the message to Carol and Rebecca, watching their faces transform with the familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation that came with rescue opportunities. "Well," Carol said slowly, "the house does feel a little empty since Oscar passed. And lynx are social animals," Rebecca added with scientific precision. "Ranger might benefit from having another feline companion." David looked down at Ranger, who was watching the exchange with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to understand exactly what they were discussing. The bobcat's purr deepened, as if he was voting yes on the proposition. "I guess," David said with a smile that encompassed 20 years of healing and hope, "we'd better start preparing for another family member." As if in agreement, Ranger stretched luxuriously across David's lap, his contentment radiating through the quiet house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love knows no boundaries. But tonight, they were simply a family watching movies together, the most natural thing in the world. The credits rolled on the documentary as David filmed one final video for their supporters, capturing Ranger's evening routine of checking on each family member before settling in for the night. In the recording, you could hear David's voice, warm with gratitude. "Some folks say we saved Ranger, but the truth is, he saved us. He taught us that family isn't about what you are, it's about who you choose to love." The good Lord works in mysterious ways, David thought, echoing his grandfather's favorite saying as he watched Ranger curl up for the night. Sometimes he sends healing on four paws and a purr that sounds like distant thunder. Outside, the stars shone bright over Oregon, and all was well in the house that love built. Sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones nobody saw coming. David McCormick thought his heart was too old for new love when a dying bobcat named Ranger came into his life. What started as a rescue mission became something far more precious, a second chance at family, forgiveness, and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't ask questions about species or circumstance. Through 24 hours that could have ended in heartbreak, David discovered that the bonds we choose are often stronger than the ones we're born with. When his estranged daughter, Rebecca, returned after 20 years of silence, it wasn't just to save Ranger, it was to save them all. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to rebuild what was broken, never too wrong to love something the world says you shouldn't, and never too old to believe in miracles that purr. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, the McCormick family proves that love really does know no boundaries. Some blessings come disguised as troubles, and sometimes the family you need finds you when you're brave enough to open your heart again. What unexpected blessing has found its way into your life when you needed it most? Have you ever experienced a love that others didn't understand but changed everything for you? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has surprised you.